Hello everyone, my name is Professor Michael Blissenden, University of Western Sydney, in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. And my paper is on a post-COVID learning environment and the use of scaffolding in higher education. So of course in a post-COVID environment we've seen many universities respond by maintaining an online environment rather than coming back to a face-to-face educational situation. Some universities, of course, have responded by doing a combination of online and face-to-face. At the University of New England, the approach has been to maintain a fully online environment, which of course poses challenges for both educators and students in the context of being able to develop a learning approach whereby there is, in many ways, not a great deal of interaction between the teacher and the student. So we have had to rethink a lot of our approaches, and we have to start to think about how we can use, and in my context, to be using scaffolding. Now, in my particular discipline, it's law, and so I was just going to run through a few examples of that. But I think it can also be used across a number of the disciplines in a higher education format. Now, scaffolding has been touched upon by a number of authors in the literature, and this is quite useful, of course, in terms of being able to develop an approach for students by which they can move from little understanding or just basic knowledge to application of knowledge in new circumstances or new situations. But there's very little that's actually been done for the longer term lifelong learning, and I want to touch on that as well. So first of all, from a perspective of principles of instruction and learning, of course we've got the first principles of instruction from David Merrill, and I'll just touch on them briefly. So first of all, we've got learning is promoted when learners are engaged in solving real-world problems. Learning is promoted when learners are engaged in solving and applying existing knowledge and activating it for new knowledge. Learning is promoted when new knowledge is demonstrated to the learner. So we're moving up with the scaffolding approach. And learning is promoted when the new knowledge is integrated into the learning's world. That last aspect I think is quite important, because there is an assumption that by that point in time the learner is able to apply themselves to any new situation. Well, that may or may not be the case, and it really will depend on how the scaffolding has been undertaken. So Merrill's first principles of instruction, of course, are very useful, but there's very little discussion on how scaffolding is used. So I think maybe we need to go a little bit further. Maybe we need to see the fact that scaffolding is in fact a part and parcel of the development between principles 1 through to principle 5 of Merrill. And then at the point 5 and the fifth principle, which of course is learning is promoted when new knowledge is integrated into the learner's world. Well, the learner's world at that point in time is basically as a new graduate. And I don't think really it takes it far enough, particularly when we consider that education has to be a lifelong exercise. And I think this is really missing. So I think we can probably safely say that the way in which those first principles have been set up and pretty much accepted as being quite a good way in which we can move students to graduates and from a learning to an application and applying it into new circumstances. And that's a good way of thinking about instruction in higher education. But I think each individual step would need to be really scaffolded. So the scaffolding tends to be at the later stages, and that's what the discussion tends to be in the literature. The scaffolding is really at the stage where, okay, the teacher falls back a little bit from being able to tell the student what to do next. But I really think scaffolding is all the way through. And in particular, at the last stage, it really is to be integrated with the lifelong learning approach, which is, of course, something that is accepted, but it isn't really discussed from these perspectives of the 5 principles. So something that we really do need to think about and take forward, particularly if we're in a fully online environment. So we need to have the exercises or the particular tutorial problems, tutorial discussions, seminar workshops that would be done online need to be structured so that we get this scaffolding approach well and truly entrenched into the learning of the student. So when they move to a graduate stage, they're not just basically saying, well, I'll just hope for the best. Now, the couple of examples I like to use from the law perspective, so we just keep that for the moment. I mean, and then I think we can explore and extend this discussion to other disciplines. But first of all, I think the first point should be that we need to understand, first of all, what the discipline of law is all about from a learning perspective. This is not looked at very carefully, and this will be discussed in the paper, of course. But from the perspective of the fact that the law is driven by first principles, and those first principles from that perspective will be legislation and cases. So legislation being statutes and cases being common law. There's a lot of interchangeable terms here, but that's really the essence of what law is, particularly in a democratic society. And we'll take it, first of all, from a perspective of the Australian point of view, which of course has been derived from the English law. And so we have legislation being passed by Parliament, and we have cases being dealt with by the courts. Now, students are aware that these are the fundamental principles. How they actually are able to apply those sources of law is not that easy to really to understand. Now, my particular area is in taxation, and in that area the law is made up, of course, of legislation and cases. It's a very complex area of the law, generally speaking. And students really struggle to come to grips with what is needed. And they're asking all the time, what do I need to know to take forward? And this, of course, comes back to the scaffolding. So the legislation itself is one way in which we can expose students to learning. And so what we're really doing is saying, well, this is the current situation. The legislation is a point in time of what the current situation is. Now, of course, we would need to explain that, first of all, as knowledge. Need to then explain it from a perspective of how to apply that in circumstances. And then how we're going to apply it in their lifelong learning. That is very rarely done, that last step, in terms of scaffolding. And we will see, and this is discussed in the paper, that the legislation itself may have gaps and may have holes in it. Now, if we do not ensure that the scaffolding approach is there for students, then that last stage of Merrill's 5 principles is missing. Learning is promoted when new knowledge is integrated into the learner's world. Well, the learner's world has potentially going to change as these gaps in the legislation may appear, and we need to be able to respond to that and maybe provide some insight to the way in which law can then, or the legislation itself, can be amended. This is rarely addressed, and so there's areas of which I explore in the paper which need the legislation to be actually amended. Now, this is rarely dealt with from a learning perspective. So if we have the scaffolding right, then students will then be able to see what these gaps and flaws are. Now, on the other side of the equation, we've got the cases. Now, the cases explore the application of the law in a dispute. And what will happen here, of course, particularly from an Australian and from an English perspective of how the law operates and common law in general, which is, of course, around precedent, where the application of cases from previous principles are applied to new situations. This is, again, another example of scaffolding from the judicial system. And of course, if students are aware of what case is and they are learning the principle from that case, that is helpful for a particular set of facts. And they're able to integrate that knowledge, as fifth principle is, and we get to that stage where hopefully they're able to do that in a problem-based scenario. But what about in a real-world scenario, which we're not sure what really is going to happen in the next case? This again is lacking in the way in which we go about the learning for students. So we really have a problem here, I think, and one of the cases which is discussed in the paper illustrates the fact that if students have been well versed in the way in which to scaffold their learning and their thinking and then apply it to a new situation, they should be able to know what the result will be from the court in the new scenario. This, of course, will be very, very valuable for their lifelong learning. So they're the two essential elements from a law perspective. But of course, depending on what discipline you are talking about, be it medicine, be it in the humanities, be it geography, be it history, whatever it might be, I think you need to step back and you say to yourself, okay, well, these are the principles of knowledge that we would want to expose our students to. Then we use, Merrill's 5 first principles of instruction are very useful, of course, but we need to apply it into our own discipline. But I think we need to be able to see the scaffolding within each of those principles for whatever discipline we're talking about. But the more important thing is that scaffolding approach is absolutely critical at that fifth and final principle. Because if we do not accommodate that, then we cannot move forward with new developments in whatever the field might be. Vaccines for COVID-19 is a classic example of that in terms of being able to use previous knowledge in a constructive and scaffolding way to find a vaccine very quickly for COVID-19. Well, that's a classic example then from a context of medicine. And we can see that in many other areas, be it history, for instance, in terms of maybe the archaeology of ancient Egypt, in terms of being able to see, taking a piece of knowledge, say for instance the archaeologist comes across in a dig and they are, I don't know what this really is, but then they have to think about where the links are, the scaffolding, between their knowledge in previous studies, which presumably would have been as a student, through to being able to apply themselves in their particular field, and then being able to come up with a new or a revised answer to the problem. And if that scaffolding is not there, then very few people are able to do that. So I think this is the essence of what I've been hoping to achieve in the paper, and I hope you enjoy reading it, and hopefully you've enjoyed this particular short video. You can contact me, michael.blissenden, so that's michael.blissenden at une.edu.au. And thank you for listening.